Hello and welcome back to One Comic Book a Day, where I've been in a argument with a internet troll for the past day or two over the story of Doomsday Clock, the DC event from a few years ago, written by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank. This conversation I was having has led to a sort of fruitful idea. I kind of want to talk about my problem, specifically the end with Doomsday Clock. And to give you a little brief history, Doomsday Clock was a sequel to Watchmen by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank to deal with the kind of retcon that Dr. Manhattan had been responsible for everything that had happened since New 52. And seeing that New 52 wasn't exactly profitable, it was utter chaos, and there's so much reading you can do about behind the scenes with New 52 and why New 52 didn't work. Mostly, no one knew what the hell was going on most of the time, and decisions weren't really well thought out. So Rebirth then set that up to kind of fix it, blaming it all on Dr. Manhattan as sort of like a metaphor about how Alan Moore's Watchmen made comics dark in the first place, which Johns had written some dark and pretty harmful comics to the industry in the past 4 years before Rebirth. And I say this as a Johns fan. I really came back to comics during his Green Lantern run, but that doesn't obfuscate the problem here with Doomsday Clock and who he's kind of putting the blame towards. So Doomsday Clock happens. It's generally not well liked. You don't really see a lot of positivity. It sold well, it just wasn't very liked. And to hammer the problem with it home even more, due to massive delays, it eventually finished while HBO had its own Watchmen series sequel happening at the same time, which ended up being amazing. Even though most of us would think doing a sequel to Watchmen is just a bad idea in the first place, which Doomsday Clock proves and the Watchmen TV show disproves. And there's a lot to complain about with Doomsday Clock, like how it kind of misses the point of Alan Moore's story a lot. I know I'm saying a lot, but a lot. Moore really likes to take what starts off as like a comic book universe and make it more into the real world, which is pretty exemplified by what happens in Watchmen. Johns, I wouldn't say has any sort of style kind of like that. He is trying to take what is ending more in a real world and make it a more comic booky world, and a very specific DC comic booky world, which Watchmen just kind of doesn't work in. And if there was any writer who could have possibly pulled this off, it's Grant Morrison, who does have the opposite style. He starts with the real world and makes it more comic booky, especially their original content. But Moore and Morrison do not get along, which probably would have made that project a lot more fun to see happen. But Moore is also a very strong believer of like intent and corporations continuing with copyrights and polluting them. So Morrison was probably not very for this. And it was actually pretty apparent in the Calvin Ellis Superman Action Comics issue they wrote. So I have to deal with the story we have in front of us, and yeah, like I said, a lot to talk about, like Superman failing to save a bunch of people from speeding bullets. Just an absolute mess of a story. The parallel of the detective movie or show that Johnny Thunder is watching, trying to be like the pirate story in Watchmen, but quite not working that way. A lot of the like supplemental material which Watchmen had not really being all that important to read, while the supplemental material in Watchmen does give you a firmer understanding of what was happening background wise with a lot of the characters. But what I'm really here to talk about is specifically what happens at the end of the story. So to give a little overview, the Watchmen characters come over to the DC universe to look for Dr. Manhattan to fix their universe. Dr. Manhattan eventually sort of realizes that the reason the Watchmen universe is screwed up is they don't have their own version of Superman, which is ridiculous. Dr. Manhattan is their version of Superman. That was the point in whatever, because it's not like a one-to-one ratio with all the multiverses and their version of Superman. They have a Superman-like character, but they're not always exactly like Superman. But this is sort of making an argument that you kind of need that one-to-one relationship, which is something I can kind of get behind. But I think, once again, the fact that Dr. Manhattan already is that character, we're missing the point. The forest for the trees, as it were. Dr. Manhattan, after having a confrontation with Superman, kind of realizes this and grows to, stop messing with the main DC universe and go back to the Watchmen universe. Now, during all this, there is other plots with a whole bunch of other characters, which really makes this comic incredibly unfocused. And there are two new characters known as Mime and Marionette, who are psychopathic murderers. Their existence in this comic is mainly to have a child. Throughout the story, they are actually looking for their child that went missing before they went to prison, or they were in prison. It doesn't really matter when that happened. But their child was stolen from the hospital and has been missing. So they're looking for their child because, even psychopathic parents might actually care about their children. It ends up being revealed that Dr. Manhattan took the kid from the nursery in the hospital, raised it himself for a few years until the kid hit like adolescence. Well, it's like 5 or 6. Names him Clark to really hit home the whole thing, gives him Dr. Manhattan-ish powers, and at the very end of the comic, he leaves Clark with Dan Dreiberg and Laurie Jubileski, Night Owl and Silk Spectre 2 from Watchmen. Now, neither Night Owl or Silk Spectre have actually appeared in this comic. They've sort of been referenced, but they're not actual characters in this comic. They just show up at the end of the story. And just as a sort of story, just by the story and the structure, this isn't a very good ending because it then makes Marionette and the Mime basically, and their child Clark, basically plot devices to specifically give two characters from the original Watchmen who have not been in the story a happy ending. In fact, a lot of the interviews and promotional material, when talking about Doomsday Clock and when Night Owl and Silk Spectre were brought up, they kept promising us that they would have a happy ending. So my argument here is this ending came up first. So the idea of the one-to-one Superman idea and the idea of giving these two characters from the original Watchmen a happy ending was what was thought of first, and then they kind of worked backwards to sort of set this up. So even though they did get a lot of time, Mime and Marionette are not truly characters. Their entire plot is just plot contrivance to get this kid to give two characters who haven't had a kid and can't have a kid at the end of the story. And that is just not good storytelling to begin with. Maybe if they were in the story more, and maybe if Mime and Marionette had more of a purpose than just to have a kid, this could work. But it doesn't. But then there's an added bit to this that just makes this feel all icky. The Mime is a Latino man, making their son Latino himself. Dreiberg and Jubileski, Miss Jupiter, whatever name she's going by, are white. So essentially, the story becomes about at least two non-white characters getting their child stolen by a character who once was white. And if you make the argument that Dr. Manhattan is white because of what happened in the Watchmen sequel series, well, that actually had POC writers. This didn't. And also, this was conceived long before the Watchmen sequel series. So essentially, a white man god takes a child away from its parents and brings them to a white family specifically so the white family could have a happy ending. The POC characters are not actual characters. They're all plot contrivances to make sure that this white couple has a happy ending. And when I read that, it kind of made me feel a little icky. And at the time, I would have given them the benefit of the doubt that no one actually thought this through. They just did a bunch of things and didn't really think about, the context or the meaning behind all this. It was all unintentional. But then everything about Ray Fisher came out. Ray Fisher has made several allegations about racism and prejudice on the set of the Justice League movie when Joss Whedon was in charge. And specifically has named Geoff Johns along with a lot of other executives of doing nothing and not really caring. This is not evidence or proof that Geoff Johns himself is racist or even has any prejudicial beliefs. It's just that combined with this, and you can even make arguments about the criticisms about how he handled John Stewart back in the Green Lantern comics, keep kind of painting a picture that's just not great. And I say that as a Jeff Johns fan, but I can't ignore some of the context of which some of his stories are in. And a lot of like authors of color have even spoken about, such as N.K. Jemisin when she took over her own Green Lantern type story, about how much they don't really like Hal Jordan and what Hal Jordan represents. And Jeff Johns is the man who is responsible for making Hal Jordan the prominent Green Lantern again, combined with how he dealt with John Stewart. And some of the stuff he does with John Stewart is great, but there is definitely a white man writing what he thinks is empowering to African Americans through John Stewart. And I'm not saying I could do any better. It's just a lot of it falls flat. And he has been criticized for that. And then you have Doomsday Clock and what kind of happens here. And it's just, there's just consistent problems with how this story is dealt with and how he's been dealing with POC characters. He even has Lebanese ancestry, but he did get criticism when he created Simon Baz, the Middle Eastern Green Lantern, who had sort of a design that gave him kind of like a ski mask, and he actually carried a gun, so connotations of that costume. You also can bring up his friendship with Eddie Berganza, who was finally let go by DC for several allegations of sexual harassment, to the point they wouldn't even hire women in his division, so there wouldn't be a problem of sexual harassment in the workplace. So women couldn't get jobs in the Superman books, which also included Wonder Woman at the editorial level because there was a predator in charge of them. He was finally let go, but it took way too long. And that's not even beginning to talk about the whole thing with Ethan Van Sciver, who was a long-time Jeff Johns collaborator who has gone completely mad and is at fault for Comicsgate and has been trying to bilk people out of money for a comic book he seems to never want to actually publish. But he's made a lot of money off that comic that's never happening. All just not great stuff. And once again, none of this proves he is racist. It's just, I keep being very disappointed by him. And that brings us back to Doomsday Clock, in a story where POC characters are treated like plot devices to make sure a white couple that's not even really in the story is having a happy ending. And when I was having this argument with the guy, he kept trying to turn it into, my problem being with this is families should only be raising the same race as theirs, and that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is non-white characters weren't really given characters. They were just there to serve the white family at the end. And that's troubling. And there's a whole question that I'm not going to get into about how like adoption isn't exactly all that great and has received criticism that it's more about a family wanting a child than what is actually good for said child, which once again this actually feels like, because it's all about Night Owl and Silk Spectre. It's not even about the child. Or even arguably, I don't 100% remember because I really don't want to reread Doomsday Clock. It's not good. But I'm pretty sure both still had family that was alive. Some of the family might have not been great. But I'm pretty sure they both had families that were still alive who probably would have liked, you know, the kid. But there's just like a lot of agency missing. And it takes this not great comic and makes it upsetting in ways that just make me angry and other people angry as well. I just don't see a lot of people talking about this aspect of the story. I've heard some people talk about it, but I've not actually seen like a really good article or debate over the ending of Doomsday Clock because, well, no one really cared about Doomsday Clock. They disliked it as a story to begin with. I feel the same way I feel about the joke that ends with the punchline of a woman being pushed out of an airplane. It's a terrible punchline, but the way the joke is crafted is to try to figure out what to say to make you feel okay about a woman being pushed out the window. Yeah, the kid's parents were psychopaths, but that is 100% designed and was chosen so we would feel good that the kid was taken away from them and given to this family. It's not a well-crafted story. It's something made from the back to make something that was awful feel good. And honestly, if I just keep talking, I'm going to just loop around the same ideas over and over again. It's a story that was troubling. I really wish there had been more diversity at the top of DC at the time, because like just one person had to have read this out loud and went, I don't know about this. So that is it for my comic today. I know it was a little more serious and not as fun as talking about Superman kidnapping people and becoming to cheat in football games. But we'll return to that tomorrow. I still have a Superman story from issue 8 to deal with. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon to get notifications when a new video goes up. I do this Monday through Friday, but Fridays is Bat Friday, where I cover a Batman story from the main line of Batman comics or a Batman story from Detective Comics. And until next time, have a good day.